welcome to Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I'm Cynthia Minkovich, Chair of the Department of Population, Family, and Reproductive Health, and I'm delighted to once again partner with Maryland Family Network on this lecture, which honors the legacy of a true champion for young children, Sandra Skolnik. Everyone at Bloomberg School of Public Health takes the first 5 years of a child's life seriously. In my department, Population, Family, and Reproductive Health, one of our goals is to improve the life course for vulnerable expectant families and families with young children. We do this by conducting and translating innovative research to help transform early childhood policy and practice, and by training the next generation of leaders who will further this goal. I'm proud of the work we do, and I'm especially proud when we work together with others who share that vision. This lecture, all 15 years of it, is an excellent example of this kind of collaboration. To quote one of our past Skolnik lectures, James Heckman, the best way to improve the American workforce in the 21st century is to invest in early childhood education to ensure that even the most disadvantaged children have the opportunities to succeed along their more advantaged peers. Thank you all for being here tonight, in person as well as online, as we work together to realize our collective vision for the future of all young children. For those joining us remotely, we have muted your audio. However, you will have an opportunity to submit questions online via the Q&A portal on Zoom. The last 25 minutes of our lecture is reserved for Q&A, so we look forward to hearing from you. I want to express my deep appreciation to my department colleagues, especially Sylvia Thomas and Ruth Harley, for their work in making this event a success, as well as deep appreciation to my colleague, Mary Alice Yeske, who also has contributed deeply. I will now turn things over to Laura Wheeldryer, Executive Director of Maryland Family Network. Thanks for being here.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 15th Annual Sandra J. Skolnik Lecture. And hello to our many viewers on Zoom. We are so happy you can join us. First, a little housekeeping. If you are here with us in person and expecting continued training hours, be sure that you have checked in at the registration desk in the main lobby. And for those online who are expecting those training hours, you must stay for the entire lecture to earn your hours, and our staff will follow up with you in the days to come after the lecture. As Cynthia already said, this marks the 15th year of the Sandra Skolnik Lecture Series and the 15th anniversary of Maryland Family Network. We think Sandy would be awfully proud of how MFN has evolved over the past 15 years and that we continue to serve children and families in a way that honors her legacy and original vision for a Maryland that prioritizes the needs of young children. Our mission is to mobilize networks across Maryland to ensure young children and those who care for them have the resources and equitable opportunities to thrive. I know you all share our commitment and dedication to that mission, and I want to thank all the committed child care providers, loving parents, and advocates across the state who fight for Maryland's children to have a better future. We could not do this work without you. I'm especially pleased tonight and want to call out MFN's Champions for Children, whose financial commitment to our work is never taken for granted, especially in the current climate. We're also delighted to have a few members of Maryland Family Network's Board of Directors with us tonight. Would you please stand and be recognized if you are a board member? We appreciate your leadership. I appreciate your leadership. Thank you for being here. And finally, thank you to Cynthia and the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, which has been our partner in this event for all 15 years. The help of our friend and colleague, Dr. Minkovich, and her team who work behind the scenes to help MFN make this event a success is invaluable, a really terrific and fruitful partnership. So it is now my pleasure to welcome Dr. Josh Michael to the podium. Some of you may know Josh. He wears many hats. He is the executive director of the Sherman Family Foundation. He is also the president of the Maryland State Board of Education. Josh is a policy expert, an educator, a civic leader, an advocate for children, a dad of 3 young children. But to MFN, he will always be first and foremost a board member and a friend who we can rely on for advice and whose commitment to Maryland's youngest children is deeply appreciated. Josh? Thank you.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Delighted to be here with you. And I am pleased to welcome our speaker for this evening, Jackie Mader. She covers early childhood education and writes the Early Ed newsletter for the Hechinger Report. If you're unfamiliar with the Hechinger Report, I highly recommend it to you as a source for in-depth journalism that uses research, data, and storytelling from classrooms and campuses to make the case for improving education in America. At a time when news seems to be constantly coming at us at lightning speeds and as mere headlines, long-form journalists like Jackie and her colleagues are essential to our work as educators and advocates. I must say, when I get my feed of the Hechinger Report, I take a deep breath and read. In her 10 years at Hechinger, Jackie has covered a range of topics, including teacher preparation, special education, and rural schools. Specifically, as a senior early childhood reporter, she has written numerous stories about childcare from the parents, providers, and of course, children's perspectives. She also covered Head Start, socio-emotional learning, homelessness, play, immigration, public policy, and dozens of other topics related to early childhood. Jackie was recently named a Spenser Fellow at the Columbia Journalism School, where she investigated and reported on childcare quality and systems across the US and Scandinavia. She previously worked as a special education teacher in Charlotte, North Carolina, and trained new teachers in Mississippi. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, USA Today, and NBC News. Jackie has won awards from the Society of Professional Journalists, the New York Press Club, and the Newswomen's Club of New York. In 2021, she was one of 2 American journalists chosen for the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma's Early Childhood Development Fellowship. Jackie received a bachelor's degree from Loyola Marymount University and a master's degree from Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. Rounding out her wealth of experience, she is a mom of 2 young children. Please join me in giving a warm Maryland Family Network welcome to our speaker tonight, Jackie Mader.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction. That was so kind. I'm really honored to be here. I've been telling everyone it's really nice to be with people who want to hear me talk about childcare, because I think my friends at the playground are tired of listening to me. So it is really exciting to have a willing audience who is so devoted to early learning, a topic that I'm very passionate about. So I also want to say I'm not nearly as interesting as those of you on the ground doing this work, especially all the childcare providers who I know are joining us online. You all are the ones doing this work every day and sharing your stories with those of us who want to write about it. So thank you to all of you who share your work so I can do my work, because I could not do this without you. Today, I'm going to talk about this really unique year and a half of reporting I had the opportunity to do as a Spenser Fellow. And first, I would love to see a little bit. Do we have any providers in the room right now? Oh, amazing. Thank you so much. Philanthropists involved in funding childcare. Everyone's going to be watching you two later when I talk about philanthropy. Experts, researchers, students, academics. Okay. Wonderful. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm sure I missed a lot of groups, but thank you for being here today. All right. My 8-year-old suggested I wrap this part to liven up my presentation, but I'm going to spare you that and just share a little bit about me. So I'm a senior early childhood reporter at the Hechinger Report, a nonprofit education news outlet. We partner with a lot of news outlets around the country to publish education news. I have 13 years of education reporting experience, the last 9 of which have been exclusively focused on early childhood, which has coincided with my oldest being born. He's almost 9, so it's been a really unique experience, kind of, seeing both aspects of early childhood. I am a former teacher. I taught middle school special education. At this point, I've had the honor of visiting childcare programs in elementary schools in 21 states and 3 countries, and I will talk about a lot of that tonight. I am the mom of 2. I also have a 5-year-old, and I'm based in Austin, Texas. And I'm really excited to talk to you about this journalism that I've done. So I had the opportunity starting in 2023 to leave my job for a year and spend a year investigating and reporting on an education topic of my choice. So this fellowship brings 3 to 4 education reporters a year to Columbia, and you propose a topic, and then you just get to dig in, which is really unique for education reporters and reporters in general. So I proposed this topic that's in the gray box here, childcare quality, which was interesting to me both personally and professionally. As a mom looking for childcare, I have seen, quality childcare can exist in so many settings. But I was also really curious, what was the current state post-pandemic? And I wanted to do a deep dive into, what that state is. How do we create the types of childcare experiences that children need and deserve to have? And what is the most important aspect of childcare quality that can get us there? So this was maybe a little ambitious for a year because those are a lot of big questions. But what I kind of wanted to see is there a through line? Is there kind of a key lever, a key to childcare quality that can exist in any setting? And is that then kind of a hint as to how we can improve childcare for children? So in order to do this, I've listed a bit of what I did during the course of that year. I spoke to so many experts and parents and childcare providers. I visited a host of programs across the country, and I spent 10 days in Norway visiting childcare programs. And I looked through hundreds of pages of childcare inspection reports. And I want to say I set out to investigate quality and kind of dig into this question of quality, but it really turned into more of a look at childhood and what childhood should consist of and how childcare systems reflect our views of childhood. And I will get into that a bit later. So first, I like to set up kind of what the situation is. And I do this in all my stories in case I have a reader coming in who hasn't learned anything about early ed. Maybe this is the first early ed article they're ever reading. And I think it's important to set the stage before I get into solutions and things I've learned that may be good innovations, kind of what we're dealing with. These numbers will be no surprise to those of you that work in the industry. It's always a little stunning to me, though, to see them one after another. So some key numbers about childcare. In 41 states, more than 15% of childcare workers live in poverty. Half of childcare teachers use public assistance. The median salary for childcare providers is $13.07 per hour, which is less than animal caretakers, dressing room attendants, and tour guides. And 44% have trouble paying for their basic needs, which means many childcare providers are caring for our children in this pivotal time of brain development, yet they're experiencing food and housing insecurity themselves. I have to say, I've been reporting on early ed for 9 years, and the numbers feel like they just keep getting more dismal. Nearly half of 10,000 childcare providers surveyed last year reported burnout. More than half of center directors and family childcare owners report staffing shortages. And since the pandemic started, at least 16,000 childcare providers have closed nationwide. And I've done some reporting on this that has shown for a lot of parents that has meant you are leaving your children with elderly relatives who maybe aren't able to take care of them to the extent you would want, or even leaving children home alone. I also want to point out this picture I have here, I think just epitomizes the work of childcare providers. This childcare provider. She was amazing. This is from a program in Iowa. And these kids desperately wanted her to give them like a horseback ride. And she got on the ground and was doing this. And it was so lovely and moving. And you just see, they are all in and they are working so hard every day. Yet we know the reality of how they are paid and respected. All right. One of my questions I wanted to look into was this state of quality, right? Kind of past and present. And a study I found when I started reporting that really stunned me was a 2006 federally funded study, some of you may have seen this, that found only 10% of childcare programs were estimated to be of high quality. Now, there has not been an update to that exact study, and there likely will not be at this point. But, there are other more current research points that show quality varies greatly, and it's still lacking, especially for children of color and low-income children. So we know this is still a problem. The second data point is more recent. So nearly 45% of childcare providers surveyed in 2024 said the quality of the childcare they offer has been impacted by stressors during and after the pandemic. And this data point I worked with Rapid EC, which is a group at Stanford University. They do these amazing data projects where they survey parents and providers around the country. And this started right when the pandemic started. And they have been really key at getting data on how children and caregivers and childcare programs are doing. And so I reached out to them and said, I'm looking for data on specifically how the pandemic has impacted quality, and we couldn't find anything. So they created and sent out this survey for me. So this is exclusive data that I was really glad to have to kind of show the scope of this challenge. The third data point there, 1 in 5 children in care spends most of their day in language isolation. That comes from an organization called LENA. Has anyone heard of LENA here? Okay. I'm glad because I'll talk about it more later and it'll be new information. But LENA does work with staff-to-child interactions and conversational turns and making sure children hear enough language. So they studied the childcare programs they work with, and they found cases where 1 in 5 children in these programs are getting fewer than, I think it was 5 conversational turns every hour. So, they say something, the provider responds, that's considered a turn. So that language isolation number is pretty stunning to me. I want to say also, this is against a tapestry of more challenging child behavior. We have been hearing about this. I've heard about it from K-12 teachers, heard about it from childcare teachers, parents. I think we've seen this. Child behavior is more challenging right now post-pandemic. So teachers are dealing with a lot more in these childcare and early learning programs. I also want to be clear, in all of my reporting in 9 years, this state of quality has never been attributed to childcare providers. This is not the fault of childcare teachers. This is the result of decades of underinvestment and a lack of respect and understanding for the industry. And that became very clear to me as I've been reporting more internationally and seeing just how far and beyond other countries are in childcare systems. And we'll get more into that soon. So as a reporter, I really value centering the words of the people on the ground because otherwise I'm just typing data and it's not very interesting. As part of that Rapid EC survey, we had childcare providers, answer some questions, data points, and then also they could write in a little bit of an explanation about how the pandemic has impacted them and their childcare programs. So I want to take a few minutes and read some of these responses so you can hear from the childcare programs themselves and the owners and directors. So this is from a teacher of a childcare center in Virginia. The last few years of stress and uncertainty have changed me as a person. I don't feel I'm as cheerful as I used to be in the classroom, so the environment is not as positive as in the past. And this one from a home-based provider in Wisconsin. My mind is busy trying to make sure bills are paid and that the business will flourish. With this, I haven't been as patient as I should have been. I find myself not doing the quality of care that is normal for me, less activities, less reading. This has led to behavior problems with the children, which leads to more redirection on my part. I don't have the funds to hire an assistant as I am in home. There are days I want to close up my doors and give up the fight. A few more. This is from a home-based provider in Nebraska. I'm not the provider I used to be. I do not do activities with the kids in my program like I used to. I don't have the mental or physical desire to do so. My program does not operate with near the quality it used to before COVID. And two more. This is from a center teacher in Michigan. It has been difficult to remain positive. COVID has affected the development of children across all domains. Children have less flexibility and low tolerance and need more support from adults. The current teacher-to-child ratios no longer are meeting the needs for children birth to 3. And the final one, a home-based provider in Ohio. I am overwhelmed and feel like a sinking ship. I feel like I am not doing enough for the children in my care. So after getting these responses, which kind of take your breath away, right? It's really upsetting to read that this is what providers are going through. So I wondered, okay, so what are states doing to help? And what I found was a pretty stunning trend that is different from what I expected. It's also different from what we saw during the pandemic when we got federal funds, right? Relief funds. What I found was there were at least a dozen states, and that number is growing, that were moving to deregulate childcare rather than pour resources into childcare. So what that is, instead of funding the childcare industry, right, supporting business expenses, raising wages, or investing in higher subsidy reimbursement rates, these states were lowering the age requirement of childcare staff. The lowest age I saw was suggesting 14-year-olds go into classrooms, increasing ratios and group sizes, often in the same states where they are proposing lower or younger children working in these programs, lowering training requirements, completely deregulating certain types of care, and doing away with ratios. And I want to say, I've been reporting on this for a long time, and I hear all of you who say, there are some really burdensome regulations, and I'm sure there are that could be done away with and simplify and make things easier. And I've heard that from a lot of providers. But what I heard from providers also was these are not those regulations, right, that need to be taken away to simplify or streamline things. These are the regulations that directly impact the health and safety of children. And from my reporting, I found childcare teachers and center directors and home-based providers extremely concerned about this, which told me, right, this may not be best for childcare if the very people doing the work think this is dangerous. This is a lot of information. I just wanted to give some more examples, but I'm going to hone in on Iowa and Kansas, which were the two states I focused on in my kind of summative article that I wrote about deregulation. So in 2022, Iowa passed a law that allowed 16 and 17-year-olds to work with older children in child care centers and increased staff-to-child ratios. In 2024, lawmakers proposed allowing those teenagers to care for infants and toddlers alone and unsupervised. In 2023, Kansas lawmakers proposed allowing teens as young as 14 to help care for small children. 16-year-olds would be able to work unsupervised. When I talked to the Kansas lawmaker who proposed this bill about 14-year-olds, she told me it was ageist to suggest that a 14-year-old would not be as good as a 65-year-old at caring for children. I also want to add, before I go on, this is a very different approach, as I mentioned before, from the $24 billion, was it, in pandemic funding, right? So we're coming out of the pandemic. Child care staff had just told me how helpful that the ARPA funds were, and they got some breathing room and a rare, influx of extra money, and then we went sharply the other direction. This is also a really stark contrast from Canada, right? Who in 2021, they were dealing with a lot of the same issues we were with the pandemic and childcare. And they, instead of going the deregulation route, put $30 billion into the country's first federally funded childcare system, which is rolling out now. You may have heard it's called 10 a day is kind of the colloquial term for it. And there are challenges, and I've written about that, and I'm happy to share it. So I'm not saying that's perfect, but it's just a very different approach than we're seeing. Okay, so what are the concerns with deregulation? From the responses of some of you, I think you can imagine what some of these are. I want to read a quote from a home-based provider in Kansas that I found really powerful. When I asked her about deregulation, she said, "It's terrifyingly dangerous when you're already working with a workforce that is overworked and underpaid, and the only answer you offer is to put more work onto them. That's not going to ensure that anybody is learning, and it will not lead to safe results. People will get hurt." And I want to say this Kansas bill came almost 10 years to the day after Kansas passed a law called Lexi's Law, which was in response to a high number of deaths in childcare. So this was a kind of undoing of Lexi's Law that came from injuries and deaths in childcare. So some of the concerns that I went into in my article and I started learning about: bifurcation. So you have some states in America moving to maybe increase requirements for education or, require extra training, raising wages for workers. And then you have other states who are going this other route, right? Bringing in teenagers, raising the ratios and group sizes, which will ultimately lead to more inequality in childcare because the childcare you have access to as a child is based on where you're living, right? Which is already, that's the case for many services. But imagine, you're in childcare every day with a 16-year-old and, 12 kids, and in another state, maybe you're with a experienced caregiver, right, with 8 kids. It's going to be a different experience. There were concerns about lower quality because of these staff-to-child ratios changes, the inexperience, the lack of education requirements, and safety. This was a really distressing part of the reporting that I did with the help of a research assistance provided by the fellowship. We went through hundreds of pages of childcare inspection reports in these states that were proposing this legislation because we figured, this legislation must be trying to solve something that childcare teachers are seeing. And what we found in those inspection reports was really upsetting. There were more than 20 examples of staff working without sex offender registry checks or background checks. There were dozens of reports of hazardous items left out for children, including a gun safe with a key in it, medication, a rat trap, knives, a saw. There were situations where staff members were yelling at children, swearing at them, putting them in the bathroom as punishment for not sleeping at nap time, or spraying them with water bottles. And an Iowa state official told me she has noticed an uptick in issues where teachers are getting so overwhelmed they're maybe pulling a kid's arm or yelling at them because they're frustrated. And what this told me, right, from doing this reporting was staff are already overloaded and overworked and under-resourced and not getting the support they need. And any of us who are parents know how hard it is, right, to be around 1 or 2 young children, let alone 12 all day by yourself. And so, as a journalist and a mother, just looking at this from the outside, it sounded kind of like a recipe for disaster to me. And this is what I ended up writing. It was an article that also published with The Nation magazine, which I have here, and you're welcome to look at later. But it was called The Dark Future of American Childcare. And it was in reference to the deregulation movement. But since that article came out in December, we have already seen ongoing efforts to draw away from the childcare industry, pull resources away, and deregulate more. So continuing efforts right now, I don't know, has anyone seen the legislation in Idaho? Yes. Okay. So legislation was proposed in Idaho that would allow providers to set their own childcare ratios. So there would be no mandated ratios. I did see in the last version of the bill, I think that was added back in, some sort of ratios. But I think localities are not allowed to set more stringent ratios than the state anymore, and they used to be able to. Minnesota, I just saw, also proposed deregulation legislation. And this morning I saw Florida also propose some. We're also seeing proposed defunding of promising efforts like the DC Pay Equity Fund, right? That was on the chopping block. We are seeing efforts to starve Head Start. We know that Project 2025 wanted to eliminate Head Start. They were impacted during the funding freeze. And I saw at least one county in California has already fired Head Start teachers because their Head Start funding is not guaranteed, and they could not guarantee that those teachers would have a job. This is also happening at a time when immigration policy is impacting childcare. 1 in 5 childcare workers in America is an immigrant. So with the ongoing immigration policy, I've been reporting on how staff are afraid to come to work. Children who have parents who are immigrants, those children are not showing up because their parents are scared to bring them to childcare. And I've talked to some childcare owners who are driving to pick up those children and even making up like secret knocks so that the parents know, oh, the childcare director is at my front door. It's safe for me to open it. And they get their child, take them to childcare, and then bring them home at the end of the day. So this is having an impact on the childcare system, especially if programs are losing children, right? That will impact the economic viability of these programs. Okay, that was a really dark 18, 19 minutes. Thank you for, no one left, so thank you for staying with me. And the next bit will be more upbeat, I promise. So I want to take a look at what is working and kind of what possibilities exist to rethink or improve childcare. And so part of my reporting, I set out to look at quality and figure out, kind of this key lever to improving quality. And I did find an answer to that, and I'd be curious to hear later if anyone else has other answers to that. But I also, I learned a lot about childhood, efforts to protect childhood. I took a look at philanthropy and how philanthropic efforts can impact the childcare industry, and also some policies and funding options from around the country. And I wouldn't be a journalist without also adding in a part at the end about the importance of media. So we'll get to that as well. So if you remember, before I got bogged down in all this deregulation news, I was trying to answer the central question of how can we improve childcare quality? And after talking to a lot of experts and teachers, I asked every childcare provider I visited, what's the most important part of quality? And almost every single one said the relationships and interactions with the children. And, that's really heartening, experts told me, because that can be done in any setting, right? It's not buying a curriculum or, going to a special training, getting a degree. But the hard part about that is these policies we're talking about impact those interactions, right? So I talked to a childcare provider in Mississippi where they have a really high staff to child ratio. I think it's 1 to 12 2-year-olds. And she said when the ratios get higher, all you're doing is changing diapers and trying to keep kids alive. And she's not really having the opportunity to have those meaningful interactions. And so I have this quote from Bridget Hamry, who a lot of you may have heard of, and I want to read it. I talked to her about interactions. She said, of all the things that matter in children's experiences in a classroom, nothing is more important than the relationships and interactions they have with the educators and other children that they spend time with. Other elements of quality, like teacher education and ratios, are only important to the degree in which they change the way that teachers interact with kids. So, looking into interactions, there's also a scientific reason for why this is so important, and that reason is the serve and return nature of why brains develop, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. That serve and return was coined by researchers at Harvard University, and it explains kind of, a baby coos and maybe an adult says, oh, tell me more, something better than that. And they keep going back and forth. And that's how brains develop. And you're wiring the brain in these really positive ways, right? Starting with babies who can't even talk back to you. But this banter is so powerful, it creates the circuits of the brain that are kind of underwiring, working memory and reading skills and language development and SEL skills and academic skills. And it's just this really important way to help kids' brains develop well. So after I decided, all right, I'm going to focus a bit on interactions, I needed to see how we do that. So how do we promote these kinds of interactions that children need in the childcare setting? And what I found is, the first part of this is getting an understanding of, well, how are we doing with interactions in childcare? And I found a lot of states and cities are already paying attention to this, which is great to hear. So one example I found was in Alabama. I went to Birmingham, where they are investing in this program called Lena Grow. And I know some of you had heard of Lena. They've been around for a while. They have this little device they call a talk pedometer, and it goes inside a vest, and the child wears a vest, and I believe the coach or the teacher wears a vest too, and it records the interactions back and forth. And Lena was very clear. It does not record what you say, because that, there is concern about that. It just simply records that you talked and the child talked. You talked, the child talked. And it records kind of who is being spoken to and when they're being spoken to. So basically, a teacher and the children will wear this maybe once a week for 5 weeks or more. And then they'll have a coach who reviews all that data and shares it with the teacher. So they could say, hey, look at your data. In the beginning of the day, you're talking all the time to all the kids. By the end of the day, you're not talking as much, and you're only talking to a couple of kids. And so then teachers can reflect on that and say, oh, okay, let me change my practice. So what I saw when I was in Alabama, I talked to a lot of teachers who had done this or who were doing this, and they told me they found, they thought they were talking evenly to all the kids, and they realized, oh, there's that, really quiet rule follower, and I just assume he or she is okay, but I need to talk to them more. And, they were saying it's easier to talk to the kids, or I naturally talk more to the kids who are kind of pushing the boundaries. And they were like, that's important, but I need to invest more time with the kids who are not getting as much attention and interaction. I also heard from some teachers who said, I'm loosening up a bit with classroom management, which I'm a former teacher. I know how scary that sounds. But one teacher in particular said, growing up, I was always told you don't speak when the teacher is speaking. So she was running her story time. They were all sitting around her and she was reading a book, and they weren't allowed to speak to her. And that's just how she had grown up and what she thought was respectful to do. But after looking at her data, she was encouraged also to ask them to interrupt her and to kind of engage with the book. And they started doing that, and she very quickly saw, whoa, they're so much more engaged in story time. They're retaining more. Their engagement is up. She noticed their literacy and their comprehension was going up pretty quickly. And so these are just small little tweaks, right? And I think all of us who have taught realize we have preconceived ideas of our classroom. And this is one way to just become more aware. I also talked to a teacher who said, I noticed this one child is not getting much attention. And so during workshop time, I now go spend time with that child, one-on-one. Luckily, that teacher had 2 assistants in the room to work with other children. So this is where that policy aspect kind of comes into play. So I mentioned I had already seen that there were national efforts around this, and they have increased. So quality rating systems, there is a trend of quality systems, and I said rating, but some states like Mississippi are moved to quality support systems, and not so much emphasizing the rating. So several of these quality systems are putting a bigger emphasis on those interactions. Louisiana made that the sole basis of their quality system, I think it was 10 years ago. And Jenna Conway, who led that effort in Louisiana, is now in Virginia doing more of that same work, trying to put a bigger emphasis on that interactive piece. Texas, Virginia, Mississippi, DC have all done so as well. We've seen a lot of adoption of Lena, that technology I talked about. These are some cities that have adopted Lena. And I've seen coaching models from some states like Georgia and Arkansas and Vermont. So this could be, a teacher watches a module online, learning more about the importance of interactions. Maybe they do some video coaching or someone comes in and watches them. But I wouldn't be a good journalist if I didn't caution that I did see more data is needed on that, and it's uncertain how effective those models of coaching are. Okay, so now getting to my favorite reporting I did from this year. So as I was reporting on American childcare, I had a mentor journalist in the program, Linnell Hancock, and she suggested I look for solutions outside of America. Maybe there's a country that has solved some of the problems here or could offer, an innovative look to present to Americans. And so I was looking for, a model that would, just seeing how other childcare systems are set up. But I ended up, this is where I learned a lot about childhood and started questioning ideas about childhood. So I have this description here. I just want to read it. So imagine sending your 4-year-old to preschool, knowing they will spend nearly all day happily traipsing through the woods, climbing trees, and resting in hammocks. They will also take part in what most of us would view as risky activities for a preschooler, so building fires and using knives to whittle figures out of sticks. And they will have little to no formal academic lessons until 6 or 7. Raise your hand if that sounds good to you. Yeah. So this is the reality in Norway. They have barnehagens. I'm probably not pronouncing that well, but that translates to kindergarten in English, but it's not our version of kindergarten. It is childcare. So when I say kindergarten from here on out, I'm referring to childcare for ages 1 to 6 in Norway. So they have this really unique view of childhood in Norway, and it is all about play and letting kids be kids and spending a lot of time outside. And I think this is a good comparison for us because I've seen undertones of this approach kind of bubbling up here, like a greater emphasis on outdoor preschools. I reported on one in Leakin Park here a few years ago. Yeah, I see some nodding. Like this is growing. I think there was a state law here, right? Or a pilot program. Yeah, so this is a trend nationwide we've been tracking for a few years. And I know, with the rise of anxiety levels and more attention on the importance of play, I think Norway offers a really refreshing, important example. I also think it's important to look at other countries because as I learned from Norway, I think the way that other countries set up their childcare systems reflects how they view children and how they view childhood. And the contrast between how Norway does that and how we do that is very, very stark. So a little bit more about Norway's approach. They are so just strong about kindergarten. They have enshrined the right to kindergarten into law. They have a kindergarten act. And in that act, it says children are guaranteed a spot from 1 on because before 1, their parents have leave and are home with them. And so they say also in this act, child care programs must be rooted in tolerance and respect and teach values like empathy, charity, and a belief in human worth. And I have part of the law down here. It's kind of small, but I just want to read a few pieces that are so lovely to me. It says children must be able to develop their creative zest, sense of wonder. The kindergarten must meet the children with trust and respect and acknowledge the intrinsic value of childhood, which is just so different, I think, from the way America thinks about childhood and how childcare can support that. Something else I found really interesting about Norway, here as a working mom, I've definitely gotten, and I'm sure many of you have, right, these comments, why have children if you're not going to raise them? Or, why would you send your child off to someone else? And in Norway, I heard from several parents who said, if you don't send your child to kindergarten, you are seen as stealing an experience from them. Like you are not letting them have this opportunity to have a chance to play with other children in this. I mean, look at this setting. This was a kindergarten that I visited, right? So you don't have this opportunity to wander around the play yard with friends and experience this joyful childhood. And they also said, we want you to get to know other adults. We want our Norwegian children to build this community. So just a very different view. Norwegians also talk to me a lot about how they really view kindergarten as an opportunity to level social inequities and make sure all children have the same experiences. They said social differences are something Norway does not accept. That was a quote that several people told me in some ways. And ironically, a lot of Norway's policies have been inspired by American research. So research from Heckman on, the return on investment, or research on language and how, children hear different amounts of language growing up. So it's really interesting to me how they saw all this and put it into practice. I will say though, I'm making Norway sound great. It is. It's also the only place in 9 years I have ever been bitten by a child while while reporting. And I think that shows how much people don't like Americans at this point. But besides that, it was a lovely experience. Okay, so what does the Norwegian system look like? There is immense support for centers. So 85% of their operating expenses are paid by the government. If you get double the funding for children under the age of 3 because they acknowledge ratios are different. The cost of caring for young children is different. So double the funding for under 3 as you would get for 3 to 6-year-olds. 1.4% of Norway's GDP is spent on early childhood, while America spends less than 0.4%. Outdoor play is huge. During the summer, children spend on average about 70% of their time outside, and during the winter, about 30% of their time. So that picture at the bottom, those children were about to go on an all-day nature hike. It was about 39 degrees. There was snow everywhere, and they were off for the day, right? They have this saying in Norway, there's no bad weather, just bad clothing. And they all have the right clothing, right? There is a lot of risk, and I've begrudgingly learned as a parent, apparently risky play is really important for kids, and they do that very well in Norway. I was kind of the anxious American watching these kids as they're jumping from trees and chasing each other with brooms, and they were allowed to do all that. They were allowed to get dirty and take these risks, and I asked some teachers, don't they ever get hurt? And she said, no, and if they do, they learn their boundaries. Like, this is a time when you're learning about your body and you're learning boundaries. There was also a really big emphasis on inclusion, and that is both in the sense of children with disabilities. So they had aides who were funded by the city in Oslo who would come in and spend time with children with disabilities to make sure they had the support they needed in childcare. And there was also an emphasis on making sure any immigrant children who spoke another language had exposure to their home language or had pictures so they could communicate and show what they needed. And then also several childcare programs I visited were doing a focus on interaction. So they would make sure every so often they'd gather all the teachers and they'd say, let's make a list. Let's categorize children. Red, they're not getting much attention. We're all noticing we're not paying much attention to these kids. Orange, they're getting a good amount of attention. Green, we're giving lots of attention to these kids. And then they would all target the red and yellow kids and make sure they were getting an equal amount of attention. And then also they were very focused on kids having friends. And so they all naturally were kind of doing these social groupings where teachers said, I'm going to take these 3 kids aside and we're going to work on building friendships and socializing. They really wanted kids to feel included. That was a really big emphasis. Before I go into this part, those strollers up there, you've probably heard this, but those are toddlers napping outside in their strollers, and a teacher sits there and watches. And then the one in the middle, that's a lobby of one of the kindergarten. And on the right, that's a sample of some food. They were having bread with there were fish spreads and cheeses, and all the children could eat those foods. They provide food. So the ratios, I was talking to a child care teacher at one of the programs, and I said, it's so odd not to see babies in the child care programs, because in American programs, there's infant rooms. And she said, oh, I would love to be a teacher in America and get to hold a baby. And she kind of mined this. And I said, yes, but you'd have to hold 4 to 6 babies, right? Because of the ratios here. And she was horrified. She's like, how do you take care of them? No. and backed away from that idea. And that's because in Norway, they have very low ratios, and teachers there think they should be even lower. So their ratios are 1 to 3 for children 3 and under, and 1 to 6 for older. And there's a pedagogical leader who is a teacher with an advanced degree, and you need one pedagogical leader for groups of 7 who are under 3. This gets a little complicated, and one for every group of 14 over the age of 3. So they're very big on low ratios and having someone who's kind of the lead teacher in charge with extra training. The cost for parents, this will make all of us parents upset, is $190 a month for the first child in care, and it gets less for subsequent children. I think by the 3rd or 4th, it's free at that point. You're guaranteed a spot in a program starting at age 1, and you can choose from private, public, or home-based programs, and that is one of the reasons I wanted to look at Norway, because unlike other countries where maybe they fund childcare publicly, but you have to go to a public program, I know that would not fly here in America. So Norway offers this example of they're subsidizing all different kinds of childcare programs, and you're allowed to choose which one you want to go to. And if you don't get a spot in a program, or you decide you want to keep your child home a little longer, they pay you to stay home. It's called cash for care. They pay you to stay and care for your child. I will say, though, that is a bit of a controversial program because there are children who are lower income or immigrant children whose parents need that money, so they're keeping their children home, and teachers are saying, well, those are the children we really need to learn Norwegian, and we need them in the program. So there is a little controversy about that. And this is all happening against a backdrop of safety net programs, right? So there are very low child poverty, child mortality rates in Norway. They have paid leave, right? They have all of these safety nets to make sure basically your basic needs are met. And, Norway has gotten on a lot of high international rankings for child well-being. So UNICEF ranked them first among 41 countries in 2020. They were ranked first out of 180 countries on a child flourishing index. And also in 2020, they were ranked 3rd among 41 wealthy countries in well-being, while the United States was ranked 36th. So, and I can get more into, I could talk about Norway all night, but we'll probably have some questions about it. There's evidence that this approach works, though, because older children in Norway perform at or above the international averages on tests. They have some of the highest happiness ratings, which I think a lot of us would want that for our children. That might be the most important thing, right? More than tests. They have just this whole community of like, let's take care of each other, and the government should work for us and better our lives. I will add, there are some challenges. I've mentioned immigration. They have noticed as they have more immigrant children coming in, they are finding, researchers and teachers, this approach of kind of everyone play and do what you want is not always the best for children who need more and who need more help learning Norwegian. So there is a small movement now, and the cities are targeting some programs with higher immigrant populations to say, let's do a little more, I don't want to call it direct instruction, but it kind of is, but not academic lessons, more like, in the past, maybe a teacher would sit down to read a book and children could run and play, or they could stay and listen to the book. And now they're saying, well, let's have everyone listen to the book, because this may be the only place these children are going to listen to a book read in Norwegian, right? So just kind of formalizing it a little bit. Norway is not the only one. I have become aware of this growing effort to protect childhood in early learning systems. So Ireland has a new early childhood guideline, a set of guidelines, and they were modeled after the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Children. And so that is very focused on this idea that children have rights, and our early learning system is going to validate their rights, and it's focused on relationships with the children and the relationships and interactions with caregivers. And that the UN Rights of the Child, a lot of you may know this, but the US is the only country who has signed but not ratified that. So it's just a very different approach. I've also seen these other countries, Japan, South Korea, Tanzania, and Moldova, also have efforts to infuse more play in their early learning systems, like formalized efforts. So this is a global kind of movement, I would say, that I'm becoming more aware of. And my hope by mentioning this is to encourage those of you, online or here who are already doing some of this to see that you're actually part of a global movement in realizing this is how children learn. They learn through play and they learn from these experiences. And in doing so, you are part of this movement. Okay, philanthropy, looking at my two philanthropists over here. So going back to America, I want to talk about philanthropy because I discovered through my reporting that philanthropy has an outsized role here in early learning because the federal investment is so behind. And I've seen a lot of examples, and some of you have too, of billionaires and millionaires funding early learning. So Bezos has created some kind of quote unquote Montessori inspired preschools in 6 states, I believe. Harris Rosen in Orlando, Florida, he's a hotel guy. He has several programs in Orlando. And here I visited Milton Hershey School Trust, opened the Catherine Hershey Schools for Early Learning in Pennsylvania. It is a network of 6 schools, early learning programs. And the hope is kind of, because public investment is lacking, these private funders, from what they've told me, they're hoping that they will invest in something, it will get attention, the community will, embrace it, and then they will get public funding ultimately because they've proven that it works and they can expand it, and they've proven that this is a need in the community. I will say there are caveats that have become very clear to me. So a lot of experts have cautioned about, when I write about philanthropy, right, that there are a lot of things philanthropists need to consider, right? Are we considering the needs of the community, or are we simply coming in with what we think they need, right? How do we involve the community in figuring out the best way to fund these efforts? Are you listening to research and experts, or yes, coming in with your kind of idea? And should you reinvent the wheel or invest in what already exists? So those are some things that you have to grapple with, philanthropists have to grapple with. I will say Hershey's example, or their initiative, they've already been well ingrained in their community. There is a boarding school, and they were seeing that, I know, has its own challenges, but they have seen with their youngest children coming in a lot more needs. They're behind in potty training. They were saying they were seeing more behavioral challenges, social emotional learning challenges, and this happened kind of suddenly. And they realized there is not enough early learning opportunity in this area, and so we're going to create that. So the Catherine Hershey School for Early Learning, I visited it a few weeks after it opened in fall of 2023. It is a 51,000 square foot brand new facility, one of 6. The income limit for families is 300% of the federal poverty limit. It serves children from 6 weeks to 5 years. They have, here's a host of what they have: free tuition. They provide transportation to the school if you need it. Low ratios. The preschool classroom had 3 teachers and 17 kids the day I was there. Teachers, this was really interesting to me. Teachers received paid training for a year before they started. So they had their teaching team, and they all received paid training for a year. The pay for the early educators here is almost equal with K-12. They have services like occupational therapy, speech language pathologists, and they provide diapers, which is huge. They also have research partners. They had an in-house researcher from University of Pittsburgh, and they also had external evaluators coming in to make sure are all of their efforts working. The impact parents told me they can work more. This mother here, Tracy, she told me it gave her children a childhood. They had access to higher quality, and she was finally comfortable with the care that they were getting. All right, a few more minutes left, so I'll run through these final policies. We have also seen some other efforts to improve the situation. So I know I've kind of bashed some things happening in states a little bit, but there are some really good things happening that I'm going to talk about. So the DC Pay Equity Fund, right, is a really good example of raising wages for teachers. And there are other wage supplement programs in other states that are promising. So North Carolina, Oklahoma, Wisconsin, and Maine all have pay supplement programs. I am seeing a huge trend, and you may be seeing this too, in offering benefits for childcare staff, like free or discounted childcare. Kentucky started that, and then I think Rhode Island followed, and there's several other states that are doing that. I think at least a dozen are now doing that. And upping subsidy reimbursement rates or little things, well, it's not little, it sounds little, but it's not, it makes a big difference. Reimbursing for enrollment, not attendance for childcare. We're also seeing states like New Mexico and Vermont come up with their own funding stream for early learning, either from tapping into oil and gas money or creating a payroll tax. And a lot of mayors are getting really involved, kind of taking up the cause, passing maybe property tax exemptions or tax increases, small increases to fund early learning systems. All right, my last slide. I'm coming at this from a journalist perspective, and this is a really interesting time in early childhood education reporting because I've been doing this for 9 years and I've never had as much competition as I have in the last few years. And while that's hard for me, it's a really good thing for early childhood, right? There are newsrooms that for the first time are funding early ed reporters. And these are the reporters who dig into all the data and know the nuances, like we don't call them daycares, right? And you may see that in mainstream outlets where, reporters are not as ingrained in the issues. So there are a lot of us now, well, I say a lot, there's maybe 8 or 9. I know Baltimore, but I mean, it used to be 1 or 2. Baltimore, you have Maya Laura, right? So you have early ed reporters here. I don't know who she is. And so you have early ed reporters here that you can turn to, or national, me, the AP has an early ed reporter, the LA Times, but please come to me first. And I will say we've been able to get a lot of impact. We've had licensing rules changed. We've had laws created. California has a new state law mandating recess for children. And this all started because I passive-aggressively wrote about recess getting taken away when my own child experienced that in kindergarten. And the lawmaker cited our article when he proposed recess legislation. So lawmakers, thankfully, are reading our work. I've heard from other childcare programs who say, community members reached out after and wanted to help. And I'm not guaranteeing anything, but if you're comfortable talking to the media and you're in the childcare industry, please reach out and get in touch. You can always start by having an off-the-record conversation or just introducing yourself. It's a really powerful way, for us to share your stories and the work that you're doing. I think that's the end of my time, so I'll just say up here, if you scan that, you can sign up. I have an early childhood newsletter I send out every 2 weeks, and so you can sign that. You can also find that at the Hechinger Report website. There's my email, Instagram, Blue Sky, I always want to say Blue Ski, and Twitter, so you can find me there. And thank you so much for listening to me. I appreciate it. Sure, yes.
Okay, we have MFN staff who are going to rove with microphones, and we have an MFN staff person monitoring the chat online. And I will start with one of the questions from an online provider. Can you talk about why this movement of deregulation? I mean, I will say in the advocacy community, we all watched what happened in Idaho a few weeks ago. Like, whoa, what is happening here?
Yeah.
What do you think is driving this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the deregulation movement seems to come from a desire from legislators where they're hearing parents say, I just can't find a spot for my kid. So their thought is, all right, we make it easier to get staff into childcare programs. We allow more kids to be in those classrooms, and then we open up more spots. So it's coming from, I wouldn't say like a really like malicious place, right? It's coming from like they're hearing parents in their community say, we need a spot for our kid. And they're thinking, okay, how do we open up these spots quickly? So I would say that's where it's coming from on one hand. There also just is, there are lawmakers who just think things are overregulated. So there's a broader deregulation movement, in the government. So I would say that's another aspect of it. But the main thing I would say is the need to kind of fill spots so parents can get back to work.
Questions in the room? Okay. Oh, hey.
Yeah. Oh,
Steve, I think she's ceding the floor to you.
Thank you. So this has been a wonderful lecture.
thank you.
I don't know if you can make a scan of your slides available or MFN can.
Sure, yeah.
Certainly some of the statistics were very helpful. I'm a big believer in professional development. Although I'm retired, I still do that with teachers. So what I'm going to suggest may sound a little off, but about 20 years ago, one of the predecessors to MFN worked with the local Department of Labor and came up with an apprenticeship program for staff. So it could be people who were aides in classrooms who could become apprentices. And I'm wondering if in your international and your national survey, whether you found any promising practices along that line. And it fits with what we're seeing in most research-based practices, which is training itself isn't enough. Education itself isn't enough. But a coaching type of setting, which is close to the apprenticeship,
Right.
is a way to really put the rubber to the road. And it also provides experienced teachers with a slightly different job profile so that they're imparting some of their wisdom to the people that they work with.
Yeah, that's a great question. I reported on apprenticeships a few years ago in Milwaukee, and there was a state effort to up apprenticeship programs, and early childhood education became part of that. And when I visited programs in Milwaukee, it was really helpful. There were students going through these programs, and they were finding this was a really great way to get into the classroom and, to get their hours quickly and to get that experience quickly. Another aspect of this, which I feel like you may be interested in, I was talking to experienced teachers who said, we can get more money if we have an extra degree, but we've been working for 20 years. And Milwaukee was figuring out how to take their experience and turn that into a degree. Yeah, you've probably heard that before. So I found Milwaukee was a really interesting place. And if you email me, I'd be happy to send you that article to read more about what they're doing. Yeah.
Maureen?
Thank you so much, Maureen Black from the University of Maryland. Your talk was just wonderful. And I wanted to ask, when you talk, well, sort of two things. I'll try and put them together. First, in Norway, as an example, and there are some examples in our country, that the government is funded to do that. And where does the government get the money to be able to do that? That would be from taxes.
Yes.
That would be from us
paying
for it. So one question is, how do we do that? How do we make the communities, the families, willing to pay for it through their taxes? The other part of the question perhaps can go with that. When you answered the question about the deregulation and that people wanted spaces, that's fine. We need more spaces. But there's so much evidence on what young children need. How can we share the evidence such that those who are making policy decisions, and really even those who are in the community not making policy decisions, really understand that you can't have 20 kids and one a teacher or aide, and that what they need, as you talked about so clearly, is the interaction and is the play? So how do we go about doing that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I asked a lot of experts this question of, I mean, even I think a little broader than you're saying, but like, how do you get people to care about this topic, right? And there's the economic argument, and I think that's what a lot of lawmakers are hearing, right? And something that I've become really passionate about in my reporting is the argument about the children themselves, right? And the thought that we're talking about economics and getting parents back to work. But what about these children who are then growing up and being our future citizens? And I think in Norway, there's this understanding of, yeah, these are our future society members, and so we're going to invest in them. And that mindset isn't really here. And I don't really know how to do that. I personally just keep adding a lot of brain science in my articles and hoping that that will stick eventually. I think, I see a lot of people talking about it with lawmakers. I feel like that brain science argument is becoming a lot more prevalent, and a lot more people are hearing that. So that's what I've heard from some experts is, right, talking about the brain research, the return on investment, and that goes back to the economy too. It's a really existential question, and it's hard. I wish I had an answer for it, but yeah, other than pushing that brain research, and selfishly, I will say also, I think media plays an important role in this and talking about these issues more. And I think there is more early ed legislation happening as you see more people writing about it, especially these bigger news outlets, kind of pushing this over and over again. But that's just my personal lens. So great question. Please email me and I will get back to you if I find the answer to that.
Thank you for this incredible opportunity.
Yeah, thanks.
Very interested, very curious about your research in other countries. For a long time, I believe that a pluralistic approach to education is the best. There is no just one way to do it. In your research, have you found that there are more areas in the country that are more receptive to learning from other countries? Has there been any exchange programs in early ed? Do you know more about what's going on us wanting to learn from others? Well, the U.S. wanting to learn from others in the field?
Great question. Actually just met someone who does, maybe talk to her after, because you take teachers to.
We're taking educators. We're trying to make coalitions of educators with families, with business owners, folks that are really interested in looking at what a whole community of care would look like. I'm sorry.
To other countries, right? To Finland.
Two other countries. Finland being the one specifically that we're looking at first, but also working with someone right now in Wisconsin. We're looking to build an exchange program for home care providers in Denmark, where there would be something that in some way to visit back and forth and see what maybe we have to teach. I'm not so sure, but I feel as if when we really build those relationships and bring it down to the interactions. One more thing I'll mention, we're bringing 10 folks from a county in upstate New York to Montreal next week to visit. We just had a big conversation with Danny Sayad, who was the outgoing chief policy advisor to the outgoing Justin Trudeau. And he really said in a very incredibly transparent way in a roundtable that we hosted, Gather Round Consulting is my company, that they had such a conservative government, they decided to first go with the idea of helping parents know that once they had $10 a day childcare, they would never let it go. And the moment they had it, they would never vote for anything else. And they would be able afterwards to sort of backdoor the quality and workforce supports. I think that that's something that we may use use as a lever, but it's certainly hard going. One more thing about apprentice programs and about universities working together to build the kind of amazing supports that especially the Scandinavian and Nordic countries have made happen is happening right in Delaware. I'm working right now with someone at Delaware State University. I'm happy to talk to anybody about that, where they've just finished really investing in supporting educators so that every barrier could be removed, and there are incentives for staying in the field, and families can maybe afford childcare a little more, but mostly the workforce shortage is going to be attended to. But happy to talk more to anybody if they'd like to.
Okay, I'm not gonna lie, I kind of wish that we had like a charter trip to Norway that people could sign up for right now.
I'll take
Like,
you all.
right after, just as you file out, you can sign up, leave a credit card payment, but there's more questions in the audience. I also have some questions from online, and shockingly, they are all about Norway. So.
Well, I'm glad my question is about that then. Non-child care person in the room or educator in the room, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Following up on the question around media, have you had these talks in spaces that you're not necessarily as welcome as this room? And have you talked about these forest schools? And have you gotten the reaction from all of us? I'm assuming some like-minded folks, from maybe some conservatives. Like, does that resonate with folks? Because data is important. We all understand where the data points, but if it's that feeling of play, anybody that is above my age had that free play, and that's gone away. So does it resonate with folks in a different way?
You know, I find, so on the topic of play, anytime I write about play, they are our most read articles. Everyone wants to read about play, right? So we did a big series called The Power of Play, and it looked at play across age groups. So why play is so important for developing brains, what play looks like in pre-K. We did a middle school play story, an elementary play story, and those stories I'll check our metrics and they just keep being read. And I feel like play, like you're saying, like it transcends all different identities for people, right? Because yes, no matter what you believe in, or conservative or liberal or what, like we were all children and we all experienced, especially over a certain age, we've all experienced play and that kind of relaxed playtime. And I think a lot of people who are parents now are worried about losing that. To answer your first question, I haven't really talked in groups who are not early ed supporters. I'd be interested to see, because I feel like, you know, in general, like we're talking about kids, and for the most part, people at least act like they care about kids when I talk, but I know you all do. So it would be interesting to see, but I do feel like play is this like unifying thing. And same with the outdoor preschool idea. A lot of people who read that, people loved that story. It was in the Washington Post a few years ago, and you know, sometimes I'll like torture myself and read the comments, and
Don't do that.
there weren't many bad comments for that one though. So, you know, it seemed like a win.
You should never read the
I
comments.
know, I've stopped.
We'll talk later.
My name's Erica Meadows. I'm the director of the Loyola School, which is right here up the street in Baltimore. We started in 2017 with 18 two-year-olds, and we now have 121 children, all on full scholarships. It's lots of wraparound services with social workers and a lot of support for parents. We give free diapers, which I was glad to hear you mention that. Yeah. I just wanted to jump into the staffing issue a little bit, because as the director of the preschool, I've seen that that's been a big issue for us, particularly since COVID. And I don't know, I think if there are other child care providers or education people in the room, it just seems really hard to hire qualified, experienced, enthusiastic teachers. And we have a hard time figuring out whether it's because people don't want to be in a classroom with kids with lots of germs, or if they're worried about schools in general. Like, what is it that's making people shy away from that career? And also, as you very well pointed out, the pay scale is terrible. We actually pay our teachers really well. Very proud to say that. But we know that childcare teachers are terribly underpaid, like nationwide. So I just wanted to see if you could talk a little bit more about the staffing, and if you have any more insight in that.
Yeah, I looked into the wages a lot, and I talked to a lot of experts to figure out, okay, so instead of deregulation, right, and bringing in younger workers, what would help get people in the classroom? And there's so much evidence that these wage, like the extra compensation retains staff, and even like a small amount. I think Daphne Bassick at UVA. Yes, she's done a lot of research on that. It's like you just get a little bit more.
It was like $1,500.
Yes.
I mean, it's really small.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, they should get more than that, but like even a small amount retains your workforce. There's so much evidence that, but then you're seeing, I mean, you pay well and it's still hard. So that may come down to, right, like the way early ed is viewed, right, by society, which is another problem that we have to deal with. But yeah, it seems the wages are one, and getting like extra compensation is helpful. I was also talking to Ellen Galinsky the other day, who was telling me about research about that she had done or looked at, and she included it in her new book. And it's about like making teachers feel valued. And it sounds so simple, but I think any of us who work somewhere know it's like they looked into just like adding a little more, like bettering the culture for staff. And I would have to, please email me if you're interested in this, and I can find the exact data. But she said that found like it kept the workforce more. But you're saying even recruiting staff, maybe that's where apprenticeship comes in.
We've actually gone that direction.
Really?
We have students from Cristo Rey Jesuit High School.
Great.
4 students now that are working with us. And the idea long term is for those kids hopefully to come back and become teachers either with us or elsewhere.
Yeah.
And also students from Loyola University, Notre Dame, and Towson.
Oh, that's great.
We're working on trying to focus on that as well, but it's tough.
Yeah.
It's not getting any applicants.
Yeah.
Can I try to, I know we're running out of time. Can I try to smush some of these questions about
Yes.
Norway together into one giant question?
Okay.
Prepare yourself.
Okay.
I mean, I think a lot of us were very fascinated with this idea of risky
Yeah.
play. And so there's a couple of questions about, like, where do you see that being embraced in the U.S.? Or what do
Yeah.
you think the U.S. could do? Or is there any possibility that would ever be a cultural fit with the U.S.?
Right.
And now I'm going to add my own editorial comment here and say, this is to me one of the challenges of not having a system of childcare is it would just be an individual childcare provider or center or school deciding to take this on. And there's actually 1,000 things that need to change, right?
Yeah.
I mean, what about just like our litigious, this
Yeah,
whole like, do they
yes.
ever get hurt? Well, maybe, but then they learn boundaries. Like, I'm just imagining, lawyers sitting in the parking lot of the childcare centers handing out their cards, you know? So I don't know, perhaps you can shed some light on things you've seen, efforts to embrace like the reverence for childhood in the space for kids to be kids, or any policy advice you might have?
Yeah, that is a huge question. Good
That
point.
wasn't even all of it. But.
You can email me later if anyone has more questions. So the best place I've seen this is actually in reporting on the outdoor preschools. And when I was visiting the one in Leakin Park, I remember they were saying they've come up against some regulation issues. So here are some regulations, that maybe you do want to look at and consider. And they were, I'm forgetting the exact details, but they were kind of small ones. Oh, like needing an outdoor toilet, right? I mean, I guess that's a big one, but just
Depends
like,
who you ask.
yeah. I don't know if a 3 or 4 year old would mind too much, but just small, they needed sinks to wash hands. They had an outdoor toilet, but there was no sink there.
That's right.
So they had to get approval to have like sanitizing hand wipes or something. So that's where it kind of comes up against, right, these regulations that are there for good reason, like health and safety, but it does kind of clash with this desire to have more of a Norwegian approach. I think there are probably, Americans we are very anxious about, you see it on the playground. I do it with my kids. I was doing it in Norway, right? Like kids were climbing trees and I was like, oh, are they okay? And the Norwegians were just, unperturbed and unworried. And so, letting them, there were simple things like kids splashing in puddles and a teacher came over and gave them a bucket instead of saying like, don't do that. So just small tweaks, I think, of saying yes more. It doesn't even have to be risky play, just more outdoor, saying yes, maybe we'll get dirty. The things, it might be inconvenient, but it might not be unsafe. So I think that may be the area here in America to start. But you're right. I mean, we do have a very different culture, and some parents in Norway, like one parent was like, oh, my kid had a scratch on her face and I high-fived her. And I was like, oh, but she's like, good playing today. So it's a different culture.
I think that's probably why it's so helpful to see it,
Yes,
right? Because
yes.
it is hard to imagine, like, what do you mean you don't have sinks?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
Well, just to end on a lovely note, I think there are, but are there folks here from Downtown Baltimore Child Care Center? Okay.
Great.
Let me brag a little bit about efforts to create this kind of space in Baltimore. And there may be others, so I don't mean to take anything away from other people in the room. But they opened basically an infant and toddler playground during the pandemic, really, or right coming out of the pandemic, that they had raised money for and, spent years designing. And I remember so well that Hillary Roberts King, the director of Downtown Baltimore Child Care Center, we were doing the ribbon cutting with the mayor, said, we just wanted a place where the answer can always be yes.
Oh, I love that.
And
That's great.
boy, that really, really
Yeah.
stuck with me. Everything is touchable. Everything is lickable if you want it to be. You can splash, you can touch, you can roll around. And it just we don't have to say no to anyone. And I think it struck on several chords, right? But one is geez, as adults, we are saying no a lot. And maybe we should put some intentional effort into saying yes.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you.
That was a good
for the work
ending,
you're
don't you
doing.
think?
That is a great ending. Thank you.
Okay. Jackie, thank you
course.
so
Thank you for
much.
having me.
No, thank you for being here. Cynthia, thanks as always. I want to thank all our folks online, many of whom are child care providers. Thank you for the amazing work that you do. Also, we know you worked really hard today and you still tuned in for this lecture, so we applaud you. Thank you all for your support of our work and these important issues, and we hope we'll see you next year, and actually we hope we'll see you much sooner than that. Take good care.